Fear of flying is a very real issue for many, and a very valid one at that. If you analyze the size of these machines sent rocketing into the sky, carrying people and their luggage at thousands of feet in the air, you would think your chances of survival are pretty low. But in all reality, more people died from shark attacks than plane accidents. In fact, in 2019, there were only 20 fatal airliner accidents. That's not to say there aren't plenty of other terrifying things that can happen while you're up in the air that you have absolutely no control over. Enjoy. I work for a national airline that mostly operated regional destinations. Mostly we used single-aisle planes. The front galley is close to the cockpit, thus it has installed CCTV. This way the pilots can monitor activities around the cockpit's door. After 9/11, everything had to be installed for extra precautions. During a flight at cruising altitude, the captain called the leading, asking why they would let two little kids play in front of the cockpit door. A B-737 is a small plane, with the cockpit door close to the crew's seats. Leading denied any kids playing near the area, but Captain insisted he could actually see two kids, a boy and a girl, playing in front of the door through the CCTV. At this point, Leading was not too happy, thinking that their pilots were pulling pranks on them. After quite some time, Captain let it go and said to never mind. When they touched down and got to the hotel, Captain pulled the leading flight attendant aside along with his first officer in tow. He insisted to know if the leading and her crew really didn't see the two little kids playing in front of the cockpit door. She maintained they didn't, and said since the galley was so small, she wouldn't miss the two kids playing. Both pilots went blank. Then said both have seen the kids playing right beside both flight attendants and wondered why they would let them be there. Flight officer confirmed what his captain had saw. But because it was so late, the leading decided to keep it to herself, only asking the crew that was with her during the incident if she also didn't notice the two kids. Both maintained they didn't see any kids. And up to this day, nobody knows who the two kids were that the pilots saw on the CCTV. I was young and wanted to see the world. At one point, I was spending a lot of time in Africa. This happened to be during a time that a certain viral hemorrhagic disease had been spotted in one of the inner countries. Back then, nobody knew much about it. We were flying to North Africa when one of the passengers begins to implode. He vomits blood, so much of it that the bag cannot contain it. We clear his row and lay him down. He looks really bad. Bruising all over his face and body, flushed face, insane fever. There was a doctor on board and he didn't know what to do. He thought it might be a severe case of malaria, but it didn't match up. The other passengers are obviously freaking out, and I'm trying to keep my cool. We landed at our destination. Since the guy started falling apart about an hour out, he was taken off the plane on a stretcher. I don't know if he made it or not. I would assume he didn't, considering the condition he was in and the mortality rate of these diseases. The truly frightening part of this was, since hemorrhagic fever had not entered the medical lexicon at that point, all of the passengers got off the plane and dispersed. No quarantine. It is sheer, blind, stupid luck that a global pandemic did not start from this incident. In April 2018, passengers on a Southwest Airlines flight heading to Dallas had to pull a woman back into the plane as she was about to be literally sucked out of the window. During the flight, something on the engine broke off and smacked into the window, breaking it. The sudden air pressure change pulled the woman into the window pane, where she hung halfway outside the plane for a few minutes. Passengers panicked. They thought they were going to crash, but the plane ended up landing safely. Sadly, the woman who got partially sucked out the window died from her injuries. My sister is a flight attendant and told me of her scariest flight. They were flying into an airport in California from Hawaii, and during the pre-landing checks, it was discovered that the landing gear wasn't functioning and that it wouldn't deploy or come down. After circling the airport to burn off fuel, fire and emergency personnel were put into place at the airport and the cabin secured. They began their descent. She was sitting in the jump seat, and she said that a fellow mechanic on board within eyesight of her looked her directly in the eye and gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head, letting her know the situation was dire. As they were coming down to land, she and the other flight attendants were in their seats, yelling at the passengers at the top of their lungs, "Brace! Brace!" while they were all in position for impact. She said it was the one time she thought for sure she'd never see her son and husband again. And then, a miracle. Miraculously, the landing gear deployed at the very last moment, saving them from having to land on the belly of the plane. Once they got all of the passengers off, sending them down the slides in the middle of the runway, surrounded by emergency personnel, racing them away from the plane. They got back to the hotel, and the last thing she wanted was to get back on a plane to go back home to Hawaii. She called her husband, who was also a flight attendant for the same airline, told him what happened, said the flight crew were being told they could either stay overnight in the hotel or fly out the next day, or fly back to the island that night on a different plane. Her husband told her she needed to get back on a plane that night, or she'd never have the ability to fly with confidence again. She did as he said. This was 9 years ago, and he was right. She's still a flight attendant with the same airline today. I will never forget my last flight from Minneapolis to Detroit in October of 2009. For starters, we had a self-proclaimed psychic on board who informed everyone that this plane is going to crash and we're all going to die by screaming it at the top of her lungs as soon as we reached cruising altitude. We ended up having to move her to a private section of the plane, trying to calm her down and ease the minds of our now panicked passengers. Cue turbulence. Sure enough, we hit extreme, unreported turbulence as soon as beverages were passed out. Drinks were flying through the air. Luggage hit a few of the overhead bins, and people were screaming and terrified, mostly due to the psychic, in my opinion. A couple other flight attendants couldn't help but cry. It was a horrible scene. After an eternity, we reached Detroit. Of course, the runways were iced over and we slid nearly sideways after touching down. Again, everyone screaming. I'm honestly surprised the plane didn't flip over. When we landed, everyone let out a roar of applause. Airport security boarded the plane and detained the psychic. I was so shaken up that I quit as soon as we unloaded. In 1972, Eastern Airlines Flight 401 crashed into the Florida Everglades, claiming 101 lives, including those of Captain Robert Bob Loft and Flight Engineer Donald Don Repo. Many parts of the plane, especially those in the galley, were deemed reusable and were therefore salvaged and installed on other planes in Eastern's fleet. And that's when the alleged paranormal appearances began. On planes where salvaged parts had been installed, the ghosts of Bob Loft and Don Repo started turning up. In one instance, the story goes that an airline VP had a pleasant conversation with a man in a captain's uniform shortly after boarding. He realized halfway through that he recognized the man as the deceased Captain Bob Loft. In another tale, a flight attendant reported seeing the face of Don Repo in an oven door. She grabbed 2 other members of the crew to come and take a look, just in time to hear the specter say, "Watch out for fire in this plane." Sure enough, the engine failed on the return flight and was shut down just before catching fire. It didn't take long before stories of these ghostly encounters began to circulate, almost always sharing a common thread. These friendly phantoms were trying to protect the planes and those aboard. The sightings weren't limited to just crew either. There were several reports of passengers seeing the same ghosts as well. Eventually, the threat of bad press and the crew's fear prompted the airline to remove all salvaged parts from the affected jets. That didn't, however, halt the release of the book, The Ghost Flight of 401, as well as a movie by the same title. Over the years, Denver International Airport has established a reputation for being one of the most evil places in the world, owing mostly to conspiracy theories rather than ghosts. Nevertheless, the story goes that you'll hear unnerving Native American chanting between Concourse A and the Jeppesen Terminal building. Employees assert that it's music being played on a loop as part of the arts program. Others agree that it's music being played on a loop, but that its purpose is to drive out angry spirits. A third opinion maintains that it's actual ghost chanting, but who really knows where the truth begins and ends? It's been reported that the airport was constructed on sacred Native American land, perhaps angering any spirits left behind. That claim has been refuted, with airport staff citing that the ground was surveyed by archaeologists prior to the build. However, in 1995, Native American spiritual leaders performed a ceremony to lay any remaining spirits to rest. You know, just to be on the safe side. My dad is a pilot. For years, he worked with a first officer known as the crazy guy in the company. He was creepy and often talked nonsense to himself. One day, the guy seemed increasingly agitated whilst flying with my dad. My dad was scared that the pilot would attempt to dive the plane into the ground. When the guy snapped out of it, he whispered, "Not today. Think happy thoughts. Not today." Rest assured, that pilot no longer has his license. I flew a dead body in a body bag by myself at night on a Chieftain PA 31350. Dead guy groaned and jerked pretty hard 10 minutes into the flight. I had it strapped down, so I don't know how much it would have moved if it had not been restrained. I muttered under my breath and looked over my shoulder for the rest of the 25-minute flight. I'm pretty sure it was the gases inside the corpse brought out by the pressure change from ground to 3,000 feet. It freaked me out either way. I was on crutches, and they called a flight attendant who was scheduled for a different flight later on to wheel me onto the plane since she was just waiting around. So she's helping me get in my seat when she sees her husband with another woman sucking on his face, sitting together on the plane in matching shirts. What I could tell from the screaming match that erupted, he told her he was going away on business to some other place than where his plane was headed. This man was so cheap he didn't even bother to pay for a different airline because he could fly for free on his wife's. The worst part was her supervisor leading her off the plane and chastising her, and told her she would likely lose her job over the public display. I really hope she didn't. I spoke to the supervisor on her behalf to try and explain, but who knows? A man with a mental illness was recently released from a short hospital stay for a mental breakdown and was being taken back home with his wife. The first mistake was that he was terrified of flying. He was mentally ill, and they allowed him to sit by the emergency exits. This was a disaster waiting to happen. You would think his wife would have enough common sense to take a bus. No, they decided to take a plane. His verbal chatter was making the entire crew uneasy. But that's not even the scariest part. He announces that there's a monster on the wing. Every time he saw it, he'd call me over, and I'd look or play along. I'd obviously just see the wing. He began claiming, "I'm the only one who can see it." He woke up his wife to show her the monster on the wing an ungodly amount of times. We tried giving him a sleeping pill, but he'd hide it away and make it look like he took it. The boiling point was when he pretended to be on his way to the bathroom, but stole a gun from another passenger and proceeded to attempt to shoot at the monster. He obviously failed. Needless to say, we strapped him in a straitjacket, and that was that. Didn't see him again. I do wonder what happened to him, though. The craziest part, the guy looked exactly like Captain Kirk. That sounds familiar. Fear of flying was never an issue for me. The first time my father took us up in a plane, I was 4. My brother was 2, and his trainer decided doing loops with 2 little kids inside was a great idea. A jackass move, but I digress. There is an endless amount of things that could go wrong when you choose to step foot onto a plane, but probably the worst thing that could occur is the irrational fear stopping you from exploring everything this world has to offer. See you next time.